Is it true that people's past experiences can affect their future? These three men all have very unique stories and show that the past can or cannot have something to do with the future. Grant was considered the greatest general in the Civil War and possibly one of the greatest of all time. He attended the military academy West Point and graduated in the upper quarter of his class. After graduation from West Point, he slowly worked his way up in the military. By February 1861, Lincoln had assigned Grant as Major General. Grant worked in the Civil War against the Confederacy in order to preserve the Union. Lincoln appointed Grant as General-in-Chief in March 1864 after the war took turn for the Union. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant in an Appomattox courthouse. After Lincoln's assassination, Grant was the most popular man in the northern states. Therefore, he became the conservative Republicans' presidential candidate for the 1868 elections. But he avoided political stands based on ideas and listened to only concrete facts. He always avoided political discussion, and he took very little stands, so this made people think he agreed with their opinions, even if he did not. He won the election anyways. But with very little political knowledge or interest, Grant's presidency did not go smoothly. Grant accepted many bribes. For example, a fully furnished house in Philadelphia and $100,000 from New York businessmen. This created doubts about Grant's impartiality. His presidency was then filled with scandals. The Secretary of State accepted bribes from merchants operating various army posts. The whiskey ring occurred where government officials filed fake tax reports and won millions through it. Also during Grant's presidency, the Panic of 1873 occurred. Small banks closed and the stock market crashed. Then in 1874, Democrats won control of the House. These were all said to be Grant's fault. Grant's past experiences did affect the person he became. Since he was a good general in the military and he won the war, people wanted him to be the president, even though he wasn't very qualified. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, on a small family farm in Kentucky. Later on, Lincoln's family moved to the Indiana Territory because of their opposition to slavery. As a boy, Abraham worked around the family farm, and both of his parents, Thomas and Nancy, were illiterate. Lincoln only had a few months of formal education at a rural schoolhouse. Most of what Lincoln learned, he learned through books. He was considered a bookworm, and people thought of him as lazy because he would rather read than help around on the farm. As time passed, Lincoln became a lawyer and eventually opened up his own practice. He fought for a seat on the Senate representing the state of Illinois against Stephen Douglas. Lincoln lost, but many people were blown away by his public speeches that he became the Republican Party's nomination for the 1861 election. Lincoln's whole plan was to preserve the Union, and he had to do this through a civil war in order to regain the southern states. He made it through the rough war and remade the nation one again. He is now considered one of the most famous and best presidents the United States has ever had. You would not think such a great president would have started out on a small Kentucky farm with hardly any education. Robert E. Lee graduated as the salutatorian in his class at West Point Military Academy. After graduation, he fought in the Mexican War and was said to be, by General Scott, the very best soldier I ever saw in the field. After the Mexican War, Lincoln asked Lee to lead the Union Army. Of course, he denied. Later, he then took the job of leading the Confederate troops in the Civil War. Things were going well for the Confederacy for a long time in the beginning of the war. Then a turning point occurred in Northern Virginia, and the Confederates were forced to call off an invasion of the North. After this occurrence, the Union started gaining more and more on the Confederates. Finally, on April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered. After the war ended, Lee returned back home, but had received the status of a paroled prisoner of war because he went against the Union. He tried his best to stay out of the public eye. Since he was a past Confederate officer, he had to apply to Johnson for an individual pardon for his actions during the war, and had to take an oath of loyalty to the Union under Johnson's plan of amnesty. Unfortunately, Lee's past did affect his future. Since he went up against the Union and lost, he became a paroled prisoner of war.